It was a brisk autumn morning when the unthinkable happened. Pam Bondi, the former Attorney General of Florida, stepped onto the political stage once again, but this time, it wasn't for a campaign speech or a press conference. No, this was personal. Her latest target was Judge Boasberg, a once promising federal judge who had found his seat in Congress, thanks to years of careful maneuvering and backroom deals. For months, rumors had swirled about Boasberg's controversial actions during his tenure as a judge. His decisions had long been seen as politically biased, favoring one party over another. But there had never been concrete proof, until now. Bondi, known for her sharp legal mind and no-nonsense approach, had spent weeks collecting evidence, scouring court records, and speaking to insiders. She uncovered a series of damning communications between Boasberg and several high-ranking members of Congress, all but confirming that his judicial decisions were influenced by political allegiances. The kind of behavior that was supposed to be outlawed in the justice system. It was time for Boasberg to face the consequences. The announcement came suddenly. Bondi had called a press conference, and the media was buzzing with anticipation. Her words, sharp and cutting, rang through the room as she exposed the scandal that would destroy Boasberg's career. Judge Boasberg is no longer fit to serve in any capacity of public trust, she said, holding up a folder full of evidence. The American people deserve impartiality, and Boasberg has failed them. It's time for him to face not only the public but also the law. The room fell silent as the implications of her words settled in. For Boasberg, it was the beginning of the end. His career in Congress, built on years of careful alliances and political favors, was crumbling. But Bondi wasn't done yet. With her next statement, she dropped a bombshell that would make headlines for days. Boasberg is facing criminal charges, she announced. The reporters erupted in a flurry of questions. But Bondi held up her hand, signaling for calm. This was just the beginning. As the news of Judge Boasberg's criminal charges spread like wildfire, the political landscape shifted. Headlines screamed across newspapers and news websites, Pam Bondi unveils corruption in high places. And Judge Boasberg faces criminal investigation. The public, long weary of the political games played behind closed doors, was gripped by the scandal. Bondi wasted no time. She had spent months meticulously building her case, and now, every detail seemed to fall into place. The charges against Boasberg were related to the illegal use of his position to sway legislative decisions, in exchange for personal and political gains. The communications she had uncovered between Boasberg and several high-ranking officials in Congress were damning, proof of a decades-long web of corruption. In one particularly damning email, Boasberg had discussed using his influence to ensure favorable rulings on cases that would benefit certain Congress members in exchange for their backing on a proposed judicial appointment. The email, marked with his unmistakable signature, left little room for interpretation. The FBI had already launched a full-scale investigation, and within days, agents were seen coming and going from Boasberg's offices. The magnitude of the charges was immense, and the federal government was now fully committed to bringing him to justice. For Boasberg, however, the walls were closing in. His once sterling reputation was shattered. Political allies distanced themselves from him. The congressman who had once been the darling of Washington now found himself the subject of whispers and accusations. His career, it seemed, was over. But Boasberg, always the survivor, refused to go down without a fight. He hired a team of the best criminal defense lawyers money could buy, intent on proving his innocence. He publicly declared that he had been framed, that the evidence was circumstantial and based on malicious intent. "I have dedicated my life to public service," Boasberg told a group of reporters outside his home. "This is an attempt to ruin me, and I will fight these charges with everything I have." But the public, once so enamored with him, seemed unconvinced. Bondi's evidence was too strong, too irrefutable. And then, the unthinkable happened. Just as the political world thought they had seen it all, something unexpected happened, a twist that no one could have predicted. Pam Bondi, never one to shy away from a confrontation, had a surprise up her sleeve. While Boasberg's defense team attempted to discredit the evidence against him, Bondi dug even deeper. In a stunning turn of events, she revealed an audio recording that would forever change the course of the investigation. The recording was made in secret, captured during a meeting between Judge Boasberg and a prominent lobbyist who had been linked to several controversial bills passing through Congress. The conversation, filled with compromising admissions, was damning. "You do what I tell you, and they'll make sure your bills get passed," Boasberg's voice could be clearly heard on the tape. "I need your backing for the next phase of my career, and in return, you'll get everything you want. I just need the right vote at the right time. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours." The lobbyist, heard on the tape, responded eagerly, "Of course, Judge. We've got your back. We'll make sure the rest of the votes line up for your appointment. You just make sure we get the rulings we need." This audio was the final nail in the coffin for Boasberg. It not only proved the depth of his corruption but also painted a grim picture of a judge who had been willing to sacrifice justice for political gain. It was no longer just about biased rulings, it was about bribery, coercion, and the very manipulation of the judicial system for personal and financial benefit. When the tape was played in public, it left the media in a frenzy. The press conference that followed Bondi's announcement was unlike anything seen before. The room was flooded with reporters, their cameras flashing wildly as the shocking details of the conspiracy unfolded. This wasn't just about Boasberg anymore, it was about the larger network of corruption he had been a part of. Boasberg's legal team tried desperately to claim that the recording was doctored or taken out of context, but the evidence was mounting. The lobbyist at the center of the scandal, a key figure in several past legislative victories, had gone silent. His sudden disappearance raised more questions than answers, and the FBI quickly moved to investigate his ties further. The scandal, now dubbed Boasbergate by the media, was being discussed at every dinner table and on every news channel. The calls for Boasberg's resignation came fast and loud, from across the political spectrum. His career was no longer just in jeopardy, it was on the verge of being completely obliterated. But Boasberg refused to give up. He held a press conference, determined to salvage what remained of his reputation. "I stand by my record," he declared, his voice filled with defiance. "These accusations are nothing more than a political smear campaign. I will not be bullied into stepping down." Yet, as his words echoed across the room, the public was already losing faith. Even his most loyal supporters were beginning to question whether he was the man they had once believed in. As the days passed, the pressure on Judge Boasberg only grew. The public outcry reached a fever pitch, and even his staunchest political allies started to distance themselves. Behind closed doors, the party leaders who had once backed him were now debating how to sever ties with a man whose name had become synonymous with corruption. The FBI, now in full investigation mode, had uncovered a trail that was impossible to ignore. The more they dug, the deeper the scandal seemed to go. In addition to the bribery and political maneuvering exposed by the secret recording, investigators found additional financial records that pointed to illicit payments linked to Boasberg's rulings. Large sums of money, funneled through shell companies, had been deposited into accounts controlled by Boasberg's family members, payments that aligned with the timing of his most controversial judicial decisions. Bondi, ever the relentless force, was unyielding in her pursuit of justice. As the investigation gained momentum, Boasberg's legal team scrambled to discredit the mounting evidence, but it was becoming clear that his fall from grace was inevitable. In a last-ditch effort to salvage his reputation, Boasberg made one final move, an emotional television interview, where he broke down in front of the cameras, claiming that he had been set up by political rivals. His voice trembled as he told viewers that he had always fought for the good of the country and that the corruption charges against him were politically motivated. "I did what I thought was right," Boasberg pleaded, his eyes filled with tears. "I never intended to harm anyone. I was just trying to help my country. Please, don't let them tear me down like this." But the damage had already been done. His tears and plea for mercy only served to further alienate the public. The image of a desperate, fallen judge trying to save his crumbling empire felt less like an apology and more like a last, futile attempt to manipulate a system he had once ruled over. As the criminal charges against him mounted, Boasberg's reputation was in tatters. The Senate Judiciary Committee, once filled with praise for his judicial career, now called for his immediate resignation. Public trust had been irreparably broken, and the calls for his prosecution grew louder with every passing hour. Then came the final blow. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, a report surfaced that the Department of Justice had officially filed criminal charges against Boasberg. The charges included bribery, conspiracy to influence judicial proceedings, and abuse of power. He was facing not just a fall from political grace but the very real threat of years behind bars. The courtroom drama was far from over. The case would continue, but the verdict was already clear. Boasberg had been exposed, and there would be no escape from the consequences of his actions. Bondi, standing at the center of it all, had won. The corrupt judge's career was destroyed, and the political system was forced to reckon with the extent of the rot within its own ranks. As the dust settled, Pam Bondi's name became synonymous with justice, a symbol of integrity in a system often plagued by betrayal. For Boasberg, the fall from grace was swift and unrelenting. His name would never be spoken in the halls of power again. His once promising career was nothing more than a cautionary tale for future generations, a reminder of what happens when the system is manipulated by those meant to uphold it. The final chapter of Boasberg's political career had been written, and it was one of scandal, betrayal, and, ultimately, justice served. Months had passed since the shocking downfall of Judge Boasberg, but the reverberations of the scandal were still felt across the political landscape. The damage was not confined to Boasberg alone, it was far-reaching, a tidal wave that had shaken Washington to its very core. Pam Bondi, having successfully exposed one of the most significant cases of political corruption in recent history, had become something of a hero to many. She was hailed as a crusader for justice, a relentless force who wasn't afraid to take on the powerful elite. Her political star had never shone brighter, but with that newfound prominence came new challenges. The political establishment, long used to its intricate webs of influence, had been shaken, and some of its most powerful figures were now looking for ways to regain control. While Boasberg faced the grim prospect of prison time, the ripples of his corruption continued to unfold. His connections had run deeper than anyone could have imagined. Several high-ranking senators, lobbyists, and even members of his former party were now under investigation. The justice system, once perceived as an impartial entity, was suddenly under a microscope. Boasberg's scandal had uncovered a dark underbelly, one that many had suspected but few had dared to investigate. Bondi, however, remained focused on her mission. She wasn't just fighting for Boasberg's fall, she was fighting for the future of the judicial system itself. In interviews and speeches, she repeatedly made it clear that her work was far from over. The fight for accountability doesn't end with Boasberg, she told a crowd of supporters at a rally. This is about cleaning up the system from the inside out. This is about making sure that no judge, no politician, no lobbyist can manipulate the law for their own benefit. We must rebuild the trust of the American people, and that means going after the heart of corruption wherever it may lie. Her words were met with thunderous applause. Bondi's determination had given hope to those who had lost faith in the system, and she quickly became a symbol of political integrity, even as the power structures she had exposed began to regroup. Yet, even as she pressed forward with her campaign for reform, Boasberg's trial loomed large. His legal team had mounted a defense, arguing that the charges against him were part of a vast conspiracy, an attempt to bring down an influential man who had always acted in good faith. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Witnesses began to testify about the deals they had witnessed, and the lobbyists who had once worked with Boasberg quickly turned state's evidence, offering damning testimonies about his role in orchestrating a wide-ranging scheme to manipulate legislative votes and influence judicial rulings. It became clear that the trial would be a public spectacle, one that would expose even more about the corruption that had plagued Washington for years. The political ramifications of the case were immense. Names of prominent figures began to surface, and speculation about who would be next to fall from grace began to run rampant. As Boasberg sat in the defendant's chair, a shell of the man he once was, the weight of his actions became undeniable. The courtroom, filled with reporters and spectators, became a symbol of justice finally being served. But the trial was more than just the downfall of a single man, it was the beginning of a larger reckoning. Across the nation, citizens were waking up to the reality that the political system they had trusted had been corrupted from within for far too long. The public outcry against Boasberg was not just about his actions, it was about the realization that the system was broken, and the people who had been entrusted with its power had failed them. In the end, Judge Boasberg was convicted on all counts. His sentence was severe, years of prison time and the permanent loss of his ability to practice law. He would never again be able to influence the justice system he had so egregiously manipulated. As the news of his conviction spread, Pam Bondi remained unshaken, her focus still set on the fight ahead. The work of rooting out corruption had only just begun, and she had no intention of stopping until the system was rebuilt, stronger and fairer than before. The fight for justice, Bondi knew, was never easy. But as she looked out at the changing political landscape, she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The truth had come to light, and in the end, it had been justice that triumphed. As Judge Boasberg's conviction made headlines, the country entered a new, turbulent chapter. The shockwaves from his trial reverberated through every layer of government, from local legislatures to the highest courts in the land. Pam Bondi had become more than just a political figure, she had become the face of a larger movement, one calling for transparency and accountability in a system long dominated by hidden deals and political games. But the battle was far from over. The conviction of Boasberg, while monumental, was merely the first domino to fall in what was shaping up to be a lengthy and complicated fight for systemic change. The public's outrage was palpable, but that outrage was often disorganized, fragmented, and lacking the kind of unified leadership needed to make real change. Bondi understood that it was not enough to win the fight against one corrupt figure, she needed to spark a revolution that would fundamentally alter the way politics were conducted in Washington. To do that, she had to rally not just the public, but also other lawmakers, some of whom were still hesitant to challenge the status quo. Over the following months, Bondi launched a nationwide campaign, calling for an overhaul of the judicial and political systems. Her platform was clear: campaign finance reform, stricter regulations on lobbying, and an independent commission to investigate corruption within the judiciary. She argued that true justice could only be achieved if the people trusted that their leaders were held to the highest standards of integrity. Her message resonated with many, particularly with voters who had grown disillusioned with the endless cycles of corruption and scandal. As she crisscrossed the country, meeting with both Republican and Democratic leaders, she found herself gaining more support. But there were still those in the Senate and the House who saw her as a threat to their carefully crafted careers, their secret deals, and their backroom negotiations. One of her most vocal critics was Senator Gregory Worthington, a seasoned politician known for his long tenure and his connections to several prominent lobbying firms. Worthington publicly denounced Bondi's reform agenda, calling it an overreach and a dangerous attempt to disrupt the natural order of politics. "You don't understand the way Washington works," Worthington sneered during a televised debate. "It's always been about compromise, about give and take. You can't just tear down the system because one man got caught. This is about balance. This is about moving forward, not about punishing everyone who's ever made a deal." Bondi, undeterred by his rhetoric, responded with her characteristic calm. "No, Senator, this isn't about tearing down the system. It's about fixing it, so that it serves the people, not the powerful. And that means taking hard, uncomfortable steps. It's about making sure no one is above the law, no matter how long they've been in power." The debate marked a turning point in her campaign. Though she faced stiff opposition from many entrenched figures, there was a growing tide of support among grassroots activists, voters, and even some moderate members of Congress who were beginning to see the writing on the wall. The Boasberg scandal had exposed just how deep the corruption ran, and many realized that if the system didn't change, it would only continue to breed more Boasbergs, more people willing to exploit the law for their own gain. But progress was slow. Bondi's proposals were met with resistance, and her calls for a sweeping investigation into the judiciary were often blocked in committee. The political establishment, with its entrenched interests, was not about to give up its power easily. The fight for reform became a long and grueling battle that tested Bondi's resolve. In the meantime, Boasberg's sentence had become a symbol of the public's thirst for justice. His trial and subsequent conviction were seen as a victory, not just for the legal system, but for the idea that no one, no matter how powerful, was beyond the reach of the law. But while the trial had been a public spectacle, it had also been a reminder that real change would take years, if not decades, to fully implement. As the months turned into years, Bondi's push for reform continued. The country, divided by its political ideologies, slowly began to realize that the fight for justice and integrity was not a partisan issue, it was an American issue. Her name became synonymous with the idea that political leaders had to be held accountable, and that the public had a right to expect more from those who claimed to represent them. Despite the setbacks, Bondi remained steadfast. Her leadership had sparked a movement, and while it had not yet succeeded in achieving all of her goals, it had shifted the conversation in Washington. The fight was far from over, but one thing was clear: Pam Bondi had started a revolution, one that was destined to change the face of American politics forever. Years had passed since Pam Bondi had exposed Judge Boasberg's corruption, and while the tide of public opinion had shifted, the war for reform was far from over. Bondi's crusade to overhaul the judicial and political system had inspired millions, but the entrenched powers of Washington remained as formidable as ever. Her efforts had led to some victories: campaign finance reform bills had gained traction, and there was a growing push for transparency in lobbying. However, there was still no clear path to the sweeping changes she had promised. The influence of special interest groups, the money pouring into politics, and the resistance from both parties had created a political gridlock that seemed impossible to break. Bondi had learned, over time, that change in Washington was not swift, it was often slow and painful. But she had never been one to back down from a fight, and now, with the momentum of years of campaigning behind her, she was ready for the final battle. It came when the Senate Judiciary Committee, led by those who had once been staunch allies of Boasberg, was set to vote on a series of judicial reforms that would define the future of the American legal system. The bill proposed by Bondi's team aimed to institute an independent watchdog for the judiciary, overhaul how judges were selected, and tighten the rules surrounding lobbying and campaign contributions in judicial elections. This was the bill that could finally shift the balance of power in Washington, if it passed. Bondi knew it wouldn't be easy, far from it. Her opponents, including high-ranking senators with ties to the lobbying industry, were already preparing to shoot down the proposal. The pressure was mounting. If the bill failed, her entire campaign for reform would be in jeopardy. As the day of the vote drew near, Bondi intensified her efforts. She held rallies across the country, speaking directly to the American people and imploring them to call their senators and demand action. She worked tirelessly behind the scenes, meeting with key legislators and urging them to put the people's interests over those of special interest groups. Her message was simple: the future of the country depended on the reforms passing. On the day of the vote, the atmosphere in Washington was electric with anticipation. The Senate floor was packed with reporters, lobbyists, and members of Congress, all watching closely to see if the bill would pass or fall victim to the same gridlock that had thwarted so many reforms before. The Senate was divided down the middle. On one side were the reformists, those who had been inspired by Bondi's campaign and who believed that real change was necessary. On the other side were the defenders of the status quo, the senators who had long benefited from the existing system of political favors, money in politics, and unchecked judicial influence. The debate was fiery. Opponents of the bill painted it as an unnecessary overreach, warning that it would cripple the political system and weaken the independence of the judiciary. They argued that the reforms were too extreme and would lead to unintended consequences that could harm the country in ways no one could predict. But Bondi, standing firm in her conviction, countered with a powerful speech that resonated with the heart of the nation. "This bill is not about politics, it's about justice," she said, her voice unwavering. It's about making sure that no judge, no politician, no lobbyist is above the law. It's about restoring the trust that has been eroded by years of corruption and manipulation. The people have spoken, and it's time for us to listen. Her words struck a chord. The tide began to shift. Senators who had been on the fence started to come out in support of the bill, moved by the overwhelming public pressure and the undeniable truth in Bondi's words. As the final vote approached, the Senate chamber was filled with an air of tension. For what seemed like an eternity, the roll call continued, one senator after another casting their vote. When the final tally came in, it was a victory, a hard-fought, narrow victory, but it was enough. The bill had passed. The chamber erupted in applause, but Bondi stood silently, her face a mask of concentration. This was the moment she had worked for, but she knew that the battle for reform was far from over. This bill was just the beginning. Now, it would be up to the American people to ensure that the reforms were implemented and that the new system of accountability was upheld. As she left the Senate chamber, Bondi reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The long hours, the sleepless nights, the countless meetings with lawmakers, everything had led to this moment. But even as she basked in the victory, she knew there was more work to do. The fight for justice, for fairness, and for the integrity of the system was never truly over. And with that, Pam Bondi's legacy was sealed, not just as the woman who took down a corrupt judge, but as the leader who had sparked a movement to change the very fabric of American politics. Years had passed since Pam Bondi had fought the final battle on the Senate floor, and the reforms she had championed were now firmly embedded in the American political system. The sweeping changes to campaign finance, lobbying regulations, and judicial oversight had fundamentally altered the landscape of politics, but the fight for true justice, Bondi knew, was never finished. The country had been irrevocably changed. There was a new sense of accountability that had taken root in Washington. Judges no longer made rulings based on political pressure. The lobbying industry had been forced to operate in the light, with regulations that made it harder to wield power behind closed doors. The people had regained some semblance of trust in a system that had long seemed irreparably broken. Pam Bondi, now a seasoned political figure, had spent the years following the passage of the reforms traveling across the country. She gave speeches, met with young activists, and continued to push for further reform, determined to ensure that the new system never lost its momentum. But her focus had shifted. She was no longer just fighting for reform, she was now focused on mentorship and education. Bondi established the Bondi Center for Political Integrity, an institute dedicated to teaching the next generation of leaders how to govern with transparency and accountability. She spoke often about the need for young people to become involved in politics, to take a stand against corruption, and to never lose sight of their moral compass. Her efforts were bearing fruit. Young political candidates, inspired by her example, were emerging across the country, new faces untainted by the old ways of doing things, promising to carry the torch forward. Though Bondi had found a new purpose in education and mentorship, there were still those who questioned whether the reforms had truly worked. Every system had its flaws, after all. There were still whispers in the halls of power, still remnants of the old guard who sought to undermine the progress made. But they were no longer as powerful as they once were. The people, empowered by the reforms, would not let their voices be silenced again. In the final years of her career, Bondi returned to her roots, fighting in the courtroom, where it all began.